Great. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here today. This is the breakout session on preserving affordable housing, understanding the needs of owners and renters. Hopefully everyone intended to be in this session. I'm Julie Stern. I'm a housing development officer with the Office of Economic Development at the City and County of Denver. So I work with developers who are seeking financing from the city for affordable housing development and preservation. Before we get started, a few housekeeping remarks. First, an announcement about Spanish translation.
Buenos días. Vamos a tener interpretación disponible. Si hay alguien que necesita interpretación de inglés a español, voy a estar disponible por la puerta de atrás.
So in case anyone was curious, we just said Spanish translation is available. The panel will be speaking in English, and Spanish speakers are also encouraged to ask questions, and those will be translated into English. We are taking a 15-minute break during this breakout session for coffee and snacks. We have a really great second half of the session plan that Beth will describe in more detail, so strongly encourage folks to come back promptly after the coffee break. It ends at 11:45, and we will be starting on time. We've got a lot to cover, so hope to see everyone for the second half. Please silence your cell phones for the duration of the breakout session. For questions, we have two microphones. One's over there and one's over there, so please line up and use the microphones for questions. We've got a big room, so just want to make sure everyone has a chance to be heard well. The session is being video recorded. Actually, all of the breakout sessions are being video recorded. You know, we heard from many people, and I certainly feel this way, that you wish you could be in all the breakout sessions, so wanted to be able to share the content a little bit more broadly, but just so that you're aware you are on videotape this morning. Finally, just want to thank our speakers and moderators. We've got a really great panel today. And a huge thank you to our sponsors, as well as to the planning committee members who helped put this session together. So Ed Briscoe and Abe Barge, are you guys in here? Thank you guys. So our moderator today is Beth Truby. Beth is the Preservation Program Manager at the Colorado Housing and Finance Authority, CHAFA. She has 30 years of experience in affordable housing and community development. Prior to joining CHAFA, Beth was at Habitat for Humanity of Metro Denver and also had a very long career in the Office of Economic Development, where I work now. At OED, she managed over $100 million in affordable housing, community, and economic development projects, and led multiple strategic planning initiatives, including authoring the city's first housing plan, which we are still following today, and which is going to be informed by, or is going to inform the new comprehensive plan that we're working on this summer and fall. Beth holds a Master's of Urban Planning from the University of Colorado, and she is also a member of the board of the Colorado Community Land Trust. Beth, thank you so much for being here today. Welcome.
Thank you, Julie, for that introduction. I wanted to thank everybody for being here in these last throes of winter that we're experiencing. Preservation, it's been identified as a high priority by policymakers and affordable housing advocates throughout the state. We have the Colorado Housing Preservation Network that has been established with multiple partners and working to preserve both subsidized housing and looking at trying to preserve naturally occurring affordable housing as well. And obviously you all recognize the importance of preservation, that's why you're here. So I'm happy to introduce the panel that we have today. We've got three really experienced panelists that come from different parts of the affordable housing sector, so I think they're going to provide some really good information, experience, and perspective for us. We are going to have a panel session for the first half of our total breakout session, And then in the second half, we'll be having a more interactive session and looking at some case studies and being able to hear some recommendations and insights from you, and as we try and sift through what do we preserve and how do we preserve things. So as I said, I want to introduce our three panelists today. We have Liz Mueller. She's an associate professor of community and regional planning and social work at the University of Texas at Austin. And her current work focuses on the development of strategies for preventing displacement of low-income renters due to transit-oriented planning. Other recent projects include a review of the connection between stable, affordable housing and education and health outcomes, and an assessment of how state and local governments target housing funds they control, which is really one of our themes we want to look at today as well, so that's very apropos. She's widely published and has received multiple awards for her teaching, research, and public service, and she has served on the board of the Texas Low-Income Housing Information Session since 2006. I'm going to go ahead and introduce everybody now and get it out of the way. So I also want to introduce Chad Asarch. He joined the Monroe Group in 2006 after co-founding Steel Properties, the Monroe Group's development and acquisition sister company. Prior to that, he was a senior VP and associate general counsel at Aimco. And while at Aimco, he negotiated the closings of over $5 billion in sales and acquisitions, which really puts my $100 million to shame, Chad, okay? So I'm glad that you could be here today.
Company, that's all.
He's active in numerous civic and philanthropic organizations, has taught at the University of Colorado Law School and the University of Denver School of Law, and he also serves on the Federal Home Loan Bank of Topeka Affordable Housing Advisory Council. And then we're also lucky to have Franklin Campos here. He's the Affordable Housing Preservation Program Coordinator for the Los Angeles Housing and Community Investment Department. He manages and monitors the city's expiring affordable housing database, the tracking and development of preservation action plans for at-risk housing, and works on owner and tenant outreach and education on expiring affordable housing. Before joining the LA Housing Department, he was a coordinator at the Los Angeles Center for Affordable Tenant Housing, and he was responsible for a variety of outreach grants resulting in preservation of many, many affordable housing units and averting the displacement of thousands of low-income residents. So just wanted to also share a couple of framing questions for us to think about as we hear our remarks today and discuss preservation today. So these key questions that we'd like our panelists to help us explore today are, how do we identify the overlap between the housing with the highest need for preservation, for example, units that house vulnerable or low-income populations or that may be in gentrifying areas, and housing where preservation investment is most financially feasible. And I think Liz is going to have some interesting work that she's done on that topic, so I think you'll all find that very interesting to hear about. Also, how do we identify the needs and interests of the owners of this housing, and what are some of the disparate goals different owners may have when managing or looking about what they're going to do with their affordable property? What alternative interventions can we offer to meet the owner's needs and help preserve affordable units? I mean, we heard in the early session, and we all know resources are shrinking, so what else can we do besides cash all the time, which is always good too. So those are our framing questions. Those are our great panelists. So I think we want to start with Liz Mueller to sort of kick us off with an overview of her work.
Good morning.
Morning.
So thank you for inviting me here. We didn't really have winter this year in Austin, so I feel like I'm having my winter moment now. I'm going to talk about some research I've been doing. I'm the person on the panel who doesn't personally produce or preserve affordable housing. I do research on it and teach people who go on to produce and preserve it. But one thing that I've noticed in my work, and I teach in a city planning program, is that there was a real disconnect between what cities were doing and the places they were trying to foster change and redevelopment and the existing stock of affordable housing in Austin. And I began looking at that and wondering if in other fast-growing cities there were similar problems happening. So I developed this set of metrics that I'm going to talk to you about today to try and help cities be more strategic in thinking about what places are particularly valuable to residents and how we should think about that as we're both planning for preserving affordable housing, but also as cities are doing these other things that we can better coordinate these goals. My motivation in Austin was I first noticed this when we began tearing down older apartment complexes on the transit corridors the city had designated for change, and the residents of that housing began coming to city council and talking about what a disaster that was going to be for them, how dependent they were on the bus line that they used from that location, and the limited options they would face. So we began doing mapping, and we found that 3/4 of our large Class C apartment complexes, so mostly unsubsidized stock, were located within a half-mile of areas the city had designated for transit corridors, transit station areas for transit-oriented development, or other types of initiatives. So that was the motivation for developing this tool, and I subsequently received funding for it from HUD and from the Lincoln Land Institute. So with a team of folks at the University of Texas, where I am, and at Cornell, and at Fregonese Associates, who developed a scenario planning software tool that we use called Envision Tomorrow, and from the Lincoln Institute and HUD, we put together this tool which allows cities to think about the value of different locations in terms of the benefit of the location to low-income renters. And we looked at that in terms of the number of low or moderate wage jobs that someone living in that particular corridor could reach via transit within 45 minutes. So we developed measures of those using census data and the EPA's smart location data set that hopefully will still exist in the future, to be able to look at, to compare different corridors in a city in terms of the access to jobs that it provided to low-income renters. We also looked then at the amount of housing vulnerable to loss in each corridor, and for that we looked at both units that had a subsidy due to expire within 10 years, but also existing rental housing that's affordable with no subsidy, so generally that aging Class C stock. So we put together then an estimate for each corridor of how much housing was vulnerable to loss. And then finally, we put together measures of the intensity of market pressure on those areas. So, different areas of town may be designated for change, but they may be at different points in that process or be more centrally located or farther out. And so we looked at a measure out of the scenario planning software that shows you over time what's happening to the value of land compared to the value of the property sitting on it. So that gives you a sense that properties where the land is now more valuable than the structure, are vulnerable to being lost. But then we paired that with data on the value of permitted activity to see what's really happening there, because sometimes it may look like it's feasible, but there may be planning, there may be zoning and other things that are preventing redevelopment from happening. So we put together these measures. We developed it initially for Austin, and the first version that we did used all kinds of really great local data that's completely unavailable in most other places, so we then decided to transform it and make it something that other cities could use. And Denver happened to be one of the cities that we decided to replicate the analysis in to see how it worked. In Austin right now, it's being used as we begin to plan for investments in different corridors under our most recent bond initiative. We passed $720 million bond initiative for corridor upgrades of various sorts, and I'm trying to get them to think about housing at the front end before they get going on this so that we can preserve some of that. Okay, so the first step in any city is to try and figure out what are the places we should be looking at. Where should we be comparing things? So we first looked at different plans that we found for Denver where there had been areas of change identified, where the city wanted to transform it to make it more transit supportive, denser, for a variety of reasons. We also looked then at where the existing stock of multifamily housing was located. where we saw a lot of permitted development occurring, and came up with kind of a tentative set of areas that looked to us like places where it might make sense to examine them. But then we talked to a lot of local folks from Enterprise and other groups here, and just kind of ground truth that. And we came up then with this set of corridors. And I have to admit, I am not that familiar with Denver, so you can offer me feedback later on whether or not you think these are good places to look at. And interpreting a lot of, this is a set of metrics, but really it's meant to be used, each piece is meant to be used separately rather than just making an index, and used by people who have a lot more knowledge about these corridors. But from what we were told by our local folks, this set of corridors, West 38th Avenue, Colfax West, Federal, Broadway, 5 Points, Elyria, Swansea, Colfax Central, and Colfax East, represented kind of a range of conditions in terms of development pressure and the existing stock of housing there. So don't be intimidated by this map. I know it's kind of, it looks a little overwhelming. So the first thing we were trying to figure out is what kind of job access is provided by these different corridors. So these big dots on there represent for each census block group, and the dot's just in the center of the block group, so it's not meaningful in terms of where those jobs are located specifically. It's just showing us where low-wage jobs are concentrated. And low-wage jobs were defined in the census data we were using at sort of 2 levels, but generally below $40,000 a year. So you can see there's a lot in the kind of central corridor of the city. We also, on this map, are showing transit lines, with the higher frequency ones being the sort of heavier weight lines. But then underlying it, when we put all this together and control for the size of each corridor and other things to make them comparable, you can see the darkest shaded areas are the ones that provide the greatest access to low-wage jobs. So it appears that your transit system really does a good job of the sort of north-south connections to jobs. And the federal corridor over there is so faint in its shading that it looks like transit access is comparatively very weak compared to the other areas. Next, we looked at housing vulnerable to redevelopment. And there are big differences, and all of this also is available in a spreadsheet where you can dig into the details much more, and I'm happy to share that with folks afterwards. I'm just trying to show it to you in map form right now. Colfax Central has the largest stock of affordable rental housing, and a lot of that is unsubsidized. The Broadway and Colfax West areas were the next tier, and we noticed looking at this, there are some parts of town that really have very little protected affordable housing right now. So, moving forward, when we look then at the development pressure, that can mean that those areas could end up having a complete loss of whatever's affordable there over time. So that's important to keep in mind. And then when we looked at development pressure, the higher income areas are going to have higher value permits and more development pressure. So you can see that there's higher pressure there, but also in the central area. And these data are from a couple of years ago, so conditions may have changed. So putting this all together and trying to think about, what is the value of different locations, you see you have that central corridor where you have the best job access to low-wage jobs. You have the most stock that's vulnerable to loss also in that central area. And it is sort of moderate in its redevelopment pressure at this point. So, you all know a lot more about these particular corridors, and I'm hoping that when we get into the second half of our panel, where we're going through some scenarios and thinking about things, you can think more about different locations and the value of them. Because it could be true that there may be locations that appear, that don't appear that valuable in terms of access to jobs, but maybe they have great schools, or maybe there's some other reason. There are other ways you can think about the value of these areas. But this gives you some sense of where you have the greatest stock of units that are vulnerable to loss, many of them probably unsubsidized, and where you have the most value. And then the sweet spot is if you have a place that provides great transit access, has units vulnerable to loss but comparatively less development pressure, then that may be a more cost-effective area to try and act now. But on the other hand, you may have areas where there's a lot of pressure and few units available, and so if you don't do something there, you may completely lose the opportunity to preserve, and then you're looking at building new, which is going to be a lot more expensive. So I think that was probably 10. Maybe the first time I've ever kept 10 minutes. So.
Thank you, Liz. I mean, there's definitely a lot of good data there that I think will be useful for us in moving forward and trying to prioritize and look at what kinds of preservation opportunities we might want to pursue. Next up, I think we have Franklin, who I'm definitely wanting to hear from since he's been doing what I've been doing now, but for a lot longer, so I'm sure that he'll have a lot of good insights for us.
Good morning.
Morning.
It's great to be here in Denver in May. Actually, it's interesting because I got out of the airplane. I got an email before from Julie that was telling me about what the weather was going to be, and then all my life, actually, I never seen snowfall. And so when I got off the train here in downtown, I was like a little kid. After I was like, wow, taking pictures after all these years, finally in May. So here I am. So
I'll see if I can find a snowball to throw at you.
there you go. There you go. I mean, yeah, happy to be here. As Beth was saying, I've been with the housing department at the city of Los Angeles for about 12 years now. And so when I started working with the city, there were different groups that were getting together. There were different ideas that were coming together, but there was that will and there was that wanting to work on basically trying to stop the expiration of affordable housing. So the city has always had the commitment to preservation and created the Affordable Housing Preservation Program in 2004. One of the key aspects of the program back then was that it dedicated a full-time position just to do this type of work. And mainly the work that we have been doing since back then is that focusing on a lot of the initiatives, mostly policy initiatives, tracking affordable housing, databases, working with residents, working with owners. And so since then, that has taken place. One of the things that I wanted to mention is that also back then, the group, the preservation team, actually started looking for more funding that was going to allow us to expand, to look at ways that we could use different funding sources in different ways. And that's why in 2009, actually, we got a grant from the MacArthur Foundation, which I think that was key, and I think is key for many other cities, other localities to look into, to find those types of funds, not to acquire properties, but actually to help you expand and do the work. For example, the grant was for 3 years. We were able to stretch it to 5 years. And so it allowed us to do different types of work. And here now in Denver, I'm seeing that you're in the right path in terms of working on preservation. I was mentioning earlier to Julie that we actually hosted similar summits about maybe 5 years ago through all of the use of these funds. So it reminds me of the work and the hard work. So preservation basically takes time. Going back to commitment, in terms of preservation, the city actually has the political will to provide funding for affordable housing. In the early years, the funding that was being allocated for preservation was being done through our Affordable Housing Trust Fund. That mainly, it is a trust fund for gap financing, mainly for 4% rehabs, but also back then it was 9% tax credits. So we started back then allocating around for maybe 2 years only $2 million just for preservation for 9%, which later on we started seeing that that we better use those resources towards other types of goals as well. What the city is doing right now with the funding is that we're looking at our portfolio. But one thing to mention about commitment was that in political will, last year, the city committed $10 million for the preservation of affordable housing. And this is to work with different owners, look at properties to see where we could buy down affordability in exchange for extensions of covenants, but also providing gap financing for 4% bonds, maybe 9% as well. But also, it is a combination of former community redevelopment area funds that were, because the redevelopment areas in California were dissolved, so we still have all of that money. So the city made that commitment to put approximately $8 million from those funds to allow us to look into what can we do to preserve the expiring city finance properties. Also, $2 million were allocated from the general fund, which is really remarkable because they're committing general fund for the preservation of affordable housing. General funds actually provide us the greatest flexibility in terms of what we can do to preserve affordable housing. Just throwing a number out there. Last year, we were able to preserve and extend 800 units of affordable housing in 16 properties, and that was a combination of working with properties and leveraging tax credits, 4% bonds as well in there, but also debt restructure and extensions of covenants, and also at the same time working with owners of HUD subsidized housing to extend rental assistance contracts for up to 20 years. The department has had, well, we have different tracking systems in terms of affordable housing. One is for portfolio, the other one is for our occupancy and monitoring. But over the years, we created a very simple tracking system that will bring the information that we had at the housing department, but also back then we used to have the redevelopment area, the redevelopment department, but also we have tax credit information, we have HUD information, and we know how it is that there's at the national level, we're all dealing over the years trying to put all this information together. So we actively track and analyze the potential impact of the expiring covenants. So what we do is that we track the properties that are expiring in the next 5 years, and we track them by the most restrictive in terms of covenants and the number of units. So there's properties that we have different layers of subsidy and restrictions, so what we're looking at the most restrictive. In some cases, we're dealing just with properties that only have one covenant in place, or maybe just one rental assistance. So that's how we're able to do it. At the same time, we use this data actually to report to City Council, provide the information to other groups that are interested in looking at what the impact is and what the impact is going to be. So the information and actually having this tracking system that we monitor, we update all the time over the years has allowed us to work with our elected officials to request funding, basically for them to see what the need is. The current inventory is approximately 69,000 restricted units that we have in the city, approximately 1,900 properties of affordable housing. Our latest analysis actually has shown that, our latest analysis has actually shown that there's approximately 11,701 housing units of expiring in the next 5 years in the city. The majority of that portfolio is actually very subsidized. We consider them at risk, even though that there's renewal mechanisms, but we don't know what the owners are going to do every year, so we're actively tracking that portfolio. what's interesting is that 55% of the inventories are expiring in the next 2 years. So there's all these risks that are associated with the expiration, as we know. The state of California actually has a notice of intent. So it's a state law that actually requires owners of properties with affordability restrictions and rental subsidies to provide a 12-month notice and a 6-month notice to the residents and the tenants. I think Denver has something similar. We proactively track that, all the notifications. We use it as a tool to work with owners as well, to gather information from owners as to what their plans are, because it is required under the ordinance, under the state law. It also provides additional time to different stakeholders, to developers, to tenants. It provides them that 1 year to know what's happening with the property. So it gives us that opportunity to put a preservation plan together in terms of the needs of the property, but also what type of leverage do we have with the property. But also it assists us in working with residents and actually making sure that we inform the residents of what their options are when the affordability expires. Because, you know, let's face it, most of the properties are not gonna be renewing. I mean, a lot of the properties don't have renewal mechanisms like the HUD portfolio, but we also have to make sure that tenants are also informed. There are different issues with the state law that we have. There's also a right of first refusal that we have that is in the notice, in the law. Hey, even better. And so right now the city actually is in the works of developing its own notice ordinance, which is going to mirror the state, but we're gonna add additional components that works with the city and works with our properties, and from what we have learned. In terms of identifying property owners, we use a different criteria. So basically the criteria is based on location, based on proximity to transit, but also we're looking now different populations such as seniors, but also focusing on properties that are not subject to rent control. What we've been doing is that we've been looking at the portfolio and we've been contacting and aggressively outreaching to the owners of all these properties that are expiring within the next 5 years. Just last year, we started focusing on properties that have city funding associated with them, because that's where we have the most leverage at this point. So what we're trying to do is find out what the owner's plans and goals are, but also what the tenants are also thinking in terms of the properties. We did look at 149 properties, 4,400 units that were analyzed. Out of that, 97 properties, 2,843 units were identified as suitable for owner outreach and education, and to see what potential preservation transaction will come out of that. The result of that initiative last year was that 14 property owners, about 613 units, indicated interest in extending affordability. So we're working with those owners right now. And since the properties expire in the next 5 years, we still have time to go back and work with the owners. And so what we're trying to do is that, and what we're finding out that is happening with a lot of the owners, and later on I think we'll probably have that to maybe talk about that during the discussion, is that is a lot of the owners basically, they're just waiting for the time for them to exit. And so one of the things that we're seeing is that as the properties are maturing or coming up for expiration, also the owners are aging, but also the tenants are aging. So during the remarks earlier this morning, it reminded me that also, yeah, what we're finding is that we're dealing with a lot of seniors at these properties. And so it's a big issue, I think, that it needs to be addressed, because yeah, everybody's always aging in place. Lastly, one of the things that we actually do, we've been doing for many years, is outreaching to tenants at all of these buildings. So that is done actually in combination with the tracking, working with the owners. So it is an integral part of the ongoing citywide preservation efforts. So what we do, we hire a consultant to do door-to-door outreach and education. It does provide the residents a role, actually, but it also provides them with options in terms of what is going to happen with the property. Because we know that we value, because tenants are actually our eyes and ears in terms of what's happening at the property. So that gives us additional knowledge as to what the building is going through and what is happening at the property. So just in the last 2 years, we outreached to 72 properties, to almost 2,700 units of affordable housing. But I cannot stress that enough, is that having a component of outreach and education is crucial to what you're doing out there, because in the end, we're trying to preserve affordable housing, but in the end, who's affected is going to be the tenants, and especially for those properties that we're not going to be preserving. That's about it. And so I look forward to the questions and your questions, and thank you.
Thank you. While Julie's loading up Chad's presentation, I just want to share some of our inventory amounts. We've got 150 properties statewide that are expiring in the next 3 years, and about 22,000 units, I think, expiring in the next decade. And we probably have about 1,250 properties subsidized statewide, and 65,000 affordable units in that.
Well, thanks. I want to know who it is at OED has control of the weather to give snow for Franklin, because my plants have something to say about that. So just briefly about Steel Properties, we have 5,000 units. We're coast to coast. We're from California to Maine. We actually have a deal that we worked on in LA and Hollywood. That was a preservation deal. And the only reason that I want to just mention that is what we found across the country, that no transaction is the same. Even preservation transactions that otherwise have similar characteristics still don't look the same, because the numbers are different, the rules, the resources available within that state or the locality are different. And so there's also no one right way that we've seen across the country to do preservation from the government side to support it. As long as the government is interested in doing that, that's a good thing. But what has been clear to us is that it's important to have, for the developer community, clarity of what the priorities are and what the roadmap is to get access to these resources, so that one can identify if a preservation transaction is feasible. And I think that the questions that Beth started with today, particularly in light of recent, the recent development of this affordable housing fund in Denver and the city's right of first refusal under ordinance, that the city's asking the right questions about preservation and what the priorities are going to be. And I think that this is a useful session to analyze some of those issues. Just the way we think about it, at least, or the way I think about it as a developer, there are different types of preservation properties, right? You have properties that have existing project-based Section 8, where the Section 8 voucher is actually tied to the property, not to the tenant, and the HAP contract, the Housing Assistance Payment Contract that governs that Section 8 subsidy, might be expiring sometime soon, and there's pressure on the value of that property. If that property is going to come up for sale, that market rate developers or owners may be looking at that location, looking at that property to convert it from not being affordable anymore, and how do you preserve that housing? The second category is existing affordable property that doesn't have a Section 8 voucher and also has expiring rent or income restrictions, and how do you preserve that? The third category is an owner with a mission or legacy concerns that wants to keep it affordable even if they're going to sell it after they sell it. So they want the new buyer to keep it affordable, and there may be expiring rent restrictions on that. And in that scenario, because of the owner's animus motivation, you know, that's going to be an easier preservation target, but you still have to, you know, get somewhere towards market value to make that work. And then the fourth category, naturally occurring affordable housing that doesn't have any rent restrictions, but just by virtue of its either location or its income, rents, is affordable to the people who live there. But if it's in a gentrifying neighborhood, there's pressure on that to preserve it. That's not an area that my company focuses on, but it's still an issue to consider. And then the last sort of category are existing affordable properties, whether they're Section 8 or not, and they have long-term restrictions in place that aren't going away anytime soon. So that those restrictions are going to keep it affordable, and then figuring out how to buy it and renovate it so that the property itself is preserved and the quality of life for the tenants is maintained is sort of a different set of issues. And so that's kind of how I look at the world, that there are 5 different types of projects, and within those 5 different types, or among those 5 different types, you need different strategies, and even within properties that might, 2 different properties in the same category are going to have different strategies, but very different issues posed. And if you're thinking about it from the city's perspective in terms of what or where you want to put the resources, these are very different, very different resource needs. You might need more resources for one type than for another, but an interesting set of questions to determine what the priorities are going to be. Oops, sorry. Just to give you a sense, and this is just a rough example and isn't based on an actual property, but in Denver right now, the average 2-bedroom market rent is $1,765 a month. If you were going to have a property that was rent restricted to people who make less than 60% of the area median income, and you wanted them to pay no more than 30% of that income for rent, the max rent you can charge is $1,134. The reason that that's relevant, if you assume that the 2 properties cost the same amount to operate, so $5,100 per year per annum in operating expenses, per unit per annum, sorry, in operating expenses, and you deducted the annual income, so multiply that rent number times 12, deduct the annual income, you'd have your per unit net operating income, the income after expenses. And obviously it doesn't account for vacancy, possibility, and so forth. This is just a simple example. But you can see that the per unit income from a market rent property at the average rent in Denver is twice what it is for an affordable property. And if you divide that number by a cap rate, and cap rate just means if I was going to invest $100 in a property and that property generated $5 a year in income, that'd be a 5% cap rate, right? I'm getting 5% on my money, capitalization rate. So if you divide the income by NOI, you get the reverse of that, what the value is. That shows that the average value of a unit in Denver at prevailing cap rates is almost $330,000 compared to $170,000 for a unit that, if you do its valuation based on its rent restricted income. The reason that that's relevant is that if you have a property with expiring restrictions on its affordability, and market rate owners are bidding on that property so that they can convert it to, you know, market rate and not have that rent restriction anymore, they're going to pay almost twice, or it's going to be worth almost twice to them what the property's worth just if you do the same math based on its affordable rents. That creates obviously huge pressure and on how you preserve that housing when the values are so different in that scenario. So just really quickly, and then I will hopefully have time to open to questions, the way that the different challenges for each one of those categories in light of that math. For a mission-driven owner with expiring rent restrictions, you know, they're less cost-driven. It's likely to remain affordable without an excess subsidy just because of the seller's motivations. An existing project-based Section 8 property that has expiring rent restrictions, the advantage of Section 8 in that situation is that HAP contract can be renewed, and you can potentially mark those rents up, increase those rents to what market rents are for the same property, and thus kind of solve that gap between what an affordable property is worth and a market rate property is worth, because the government is subsidizing the rent. The tenant's not paying more than 30% of what they make, and the federal government's coming in and making up the difference to get the income at the property up to what it would be as a market rate property. And those rent restrictions can be layered with tax credit funds, OED funds, et cetera. An existing affordable property that has expiring rent restrictions, that doesn't have Section 8, those rents aren't subsidized, and so now you're at that exact gap that I showed in the math before, and the income and borrowing capacity is limited. It requires a larger subsidy to fill that gap. And so, again, when the city's thinking about where to put its money, recognizing that if it's going to try to preserve that housing, more money per unit might need to go to that preservation opportunity than it would for another type of preservation opportunity. And then the naturally occurring affordable housing, no rent restrictions. The preservation challenge arises, again, when located in a gentrifying neighborhood. Property taxes alone can push owners to sell given the rising land values and so forth, and to someone who's going to convert it to either renovate it and increase the rents or knock the building down and build something new just because the area is gentrifying. And then that's the threat to the loss of that housing. And so how is this housing preserved while funding necessary repairs becomes the issue. Again, that's not an area that I focus on, but it's certainly a set of issues. Obviously, the last category that I mentioned before, where those rent restrictions are in place for a long period of time and there is no pressure on it going market rate, that's a totally different story, and so you don't have the same pressures. So I didn't include the pros and cons on that. But that's basically how we look at it, and when we go into a city, obviously the issue is what are the city's priorities, where they want to focus their resources. Those are the projects, honestly, that we'll prioritize ourselves to go after just because the resources are available to solve the gap for those where they may not be for others. So welcome your questions, and thanks so much.
Thank you, Chad. Appreciate it. So we do have, I think we're going to take a break at 11:30. Is that still the plan, Julian? So we've got a few minutes for questions. So is that, I don't think there's a microphone over there, but I mean, we've got a, looks like there's a microphone over there if people want to go to the microphone, or maybe if they have a question. But maybe we can start off while, or does anybody have a question they want? Do we have a question? Okay, go ahead.
I had a quick question. The data that you showed, the last there, shows that people who are renting properties, even that have rent restrictions, are making a profit, according to what you showed, unless there's city subsidized money going into that. Now, there was subsidized money that went into the development of that, and I would see if that's positive cash flow sustainable, why couldn't just the restrictions, and then you could preserve there? Now, and then the pressure for developers to get something built that was subsidized by the city in order to take that rent up, they could build something new and be competitive that way. They're smart guys, they can go and do that. So
the issue is, all this is showing is the value of the unit. If you say, if I was going to buy a unit, let's say the market rent unit, okay, and the rent was at $1,765, and there was just one unit, let's say, and so I figured that property was worth $330,000.
So this comes at the point of sale if the rent restrictions are off.
That's right. That's right. But what you're talking about is the owner has, how long have they owned that property? What have they invested in that property?
Well, when you go back to the point of sale, the person that profits is the person that carries the loan, and not necessarily the renter or the developer, because the higher point of sale is going to be a larger loan with more interest rate for the banks.
Well, again, so you have to actually, this doesn't show the economics of how that might work, but let's say that you're an owner, let's say you built the property, right, and you built the property and you assumed that the rents were going to be at $1,500, 3 years ago, and today they're at $1,700. Well, you have debt you have to pay off, right? So it's not like you're making $330,000 if you're the seller. You're going to have to pay your debt and other types of things. So there might be some profit to the seller, but in terms of the economics of the transaction, it's not like there's a whole bunch of extra money here that's going to allow you to finance additional debt to preserve it, because the owner who's selling it, whatever reason they're selling it for, they're paying off their debt. They're, Lord only knows what their capital account looks like, what their exit taxes are, and so forth. I mean, there's a lot of financing questions on that side. But on the buy side, if you look at, you know, if you're going to keep it, the issue is if a market rate buyer is going to knock on a current affordable property owner's door and says, I will buy that property from you at the value of what it's worth as a market rate property because I'm going to buy it and assume the restrictions are going to go away.
So you're completing the sale for the guy who's needing to sell for whatever he needs to sell for, and subsidizing. So if he had a failed business model and he isn't making money on his loan, you're subsidizing him getting out of that by making it look more a property by removing the rent restrictions. If I'm
But it's not a subsidy issue. I mean, if it's just what can that current owner sell the property for
Yes.
in this market environment, and a non-affordable buyer can come along and say, I'll pay $330,000 for that unit.
More if you lift the restrictions.
Well, but this assumes the restrictions are expiring.
Right.
Right. So the issue is, if as an affordable developer, which is what I am, I don't buy market rate properties, I don't operate market rate properties. If I'm going to buy it as an affordable developer, then I'm going to say, well, if its income is this, I can only borrow so much money to finance the acquisition, and if I'm competing with an offer from somebody else who wants to take it market rate, how do I compete? Where are the additional resources I can get to compete so that I can keep it affordable? Because the market pressure, just as what happens in any gentrifying, you know, neighborhood or situation, the market pressure is going to be on having that property not be affordable anymore, having it go market rate. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I think.
Thank you for that. Good back and forth exchange. Chuck, do you have a question back there? Do you want to take a crack at that, Franklin?
I mean, I could speak to, in terms of what we're seeing and what we're focusing on for properties that don't have long-term affordability, but the properties that only have just properties that have long-term affordability, but then basically we're dealing with small investors that are not that sophisticated in terms of what they're doing with the property. What we've been seeing, like I said, is owners are actually aging, and so what we're dealing with right now is that a lot of them are thinking that they waited 30 years, basically. So now this is the time for them to basically cash in terms of what they're going to do with the property, and sell it without restrictions at a higher market level, especially if they're in gentrifying areas. But we're also seeing other owners that they're thinking about legacy. We've been working with a few of them that they care about their tenants. When they bought the property, they were probably the same age as the tenants when they moved in. Now they're the same age. And so they're also thinking of passing that property on to their sons or probably grandchildren. So this is what we're seeing for some of those tenants, especially for the city restricted portfolio. But in general, what we're seeing also is that a lot of the owners basically are just waiting for that moment. I think that there's some sort of fatigue in terms of dealing with compliance, dealing with keeping the rents, and they're seeing all of the other rents around the area are going up. And it's, as my colleague says, it's asking somebody that went to the war probably 30 years ago and asking them to re-enlist now, 30 years later, to continue the affordability. So the key is to look at those opportunities, knowing what the owner's intent are, because if we're able to hear from an owner that he's possibly interested in selling if the property is going to be kept affordable because he cares about it, then there's the opportunity to work with, let's say, Chad or any other nonprofit to make an offer and use all the other tools to be able to put that sale together. Quick example, many years ago, worked with an owner that did not want a project-based Section 8 building. And so he wasn't thinking about selling to a nonprofit. He just wanted to take it to market. And we kept on working with them. We worked through the notification process with them and kept on asking them. And it's interesting that almost a year months before the one year notice was set to expire and the HAP contract was gonna terminate, he called me and he said, you know what? You told me about this nonprofit that could potentially buy this affordable housing. I care so much about the property that I want to keep it affordable. And that's when we try to put a deal together, and we work with the different consultants to put that deal together. And actually, the property changed hands, and it went to the tax credits. So now it's a 55-year restriction on the property. I mean, sadly, he passed away. I mean, months later. And so, but then the property was kept affordable, but it took almost a year for him to think it through. I don't know if that answers part of the question.
Maybe in terms of GPs or...
Way to work that owner in having a successful outcome. So I think we're ready for our break, 11:30, and I believe we're supposed to be back at 11:45. And we will be doing some case studies and digging in a little bit more into a little more detail on some of the property types that Chad showed in his presentation. So see you at 11:45. So we've got the second half of our breakout session here with our a little more interactive discussion, but we're gonna show you some case studies first. We're gonna hear the details of some property types similar to what Chad shared in the earlier session during his presentation. Chad had to leave, so we're lucky to have Jennifer Cloud from Steel Properties also filling in for him. So she's gonna be sharing some of those case studies with us. We're going to be looking at 4 different potential investment opportunities in these case studies, and you're going to be asked then to look at and make recommendations, maybe come up with insights on which projects we should fund given limited resources and why. And then we'll be having reporting out at 12:30 with, I mean, we won't ask every table to present, but maybe people come and sharing some of the highlights that they have seen. So I would like to ask Jennifer to come up. She's going to share the first 2 case studies with us. Oh, I also wanted to mention in your housing plan, there is a definition sheet, an acronym sheet. So if you have any questions about definitions or acronyms, that should be in your housing plan. Okay, Jennifer.
Okay, so as Beth said, my name is Jennifer. I'm Development Director for Steel Properties. I'm filling in for Chad, and also, you know, these are 2 case studies that I actually existed and I worked very intimately on, so I'm happy to share them with you all here today. The first example that Chad talked about earlier for a preservation opportunity is the project-based Section 8 property with expiring rent restrictions. So in this scenario, we had a property that had a housing assistance payment contract, which is the HUD subsidy. That contract was about to expire. So we had a seller who was interested in selling the property and basically making the most money that they could off of the sale. So our goal in going into the acquisition was, how do we get that result for the seller who had a market rate opportunity? How do we match that opportunity while also preserving the affordability? And in this circumstance, we have a long-term project-based Section 8 contract. And that contract can be renewed. So those contracts are very valuable in that way. This particular project was 22 units. Because of the HAP contract, it was naturally serving residents who earned about 30% of the area median income and less. So very, very affordable property. It was located in, or it is located in 5 Points, which is a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood in Denver. And so there's a lot of market rate development going on. And the risk was, if we weren't able to find a way to preserve the affordability, this property could very well be sold to a market rate developer, and the tenants who lived there earning 30% of the AMI would have no other housing opportunity in this particular neighborhood, and so those tenants would be displaced. So they were all 1-bedroom units, as I said, 30% AMI restricted. Now, if we had that AMI restriction without a project-based Section 8 contract, the most rent that we could collect would be $472 per unit. With the current HAP contract, if we were just to assume that and extend it, that rent would be $652. So you can already kind of see the value of that housing assistance payment contract and how you can support the property operations with that subsidy while also serving a much lower targeted AMI and increasing that affordability. As Chad mentioned earlier with these contracts, you have the opportunity to mark those rents up to a market rate. The idea of the Section 8 contract is that the rents should replicate what an area's market rate rent is. So the opportunity to mark that up becomes very valuable. You can see it's $13.50 per unit for a marked up contract rent, and that's equal to the $13.50 that a market rate developer would get. So you can see how with this project-based Section 8 contract and the markup process, there's a lot of opportunity there to match what a market rate buyer would be looking at in terms of value. We can do that on an affordable level. So let's see. So our goal, of course, is preserve and improve the affordable housing. We had a purchase price of about $2.5 million, $116,000 per unit. So there are a couple different ways to approach this, preserving the affordability of this property. Number one would be using the existing HAP rents, which remember already have that subsidy, so we can fairly easily renew and extend that HAP contract at those $662 per unit. And we are able to borrow about $1.9 million. So Chad talked about cap rates and NOI. And really what that translates to is value, but also it translates to a funding source, which is the debt that you can afford to put onto that property. So the higher the rents, obviously, the higher the debt you can leverage, and that's a funding source that's going to help with your acquisition of the property. So with the current HAP contract, we could have purchased the property with the current the current rents that supported about $1.9 million of debt. And then since those rents weren't comparable to market rents, we still do need some amount of soft funds or local municipality subsidy. So in this case, we were asking for about $750,000 from OED to fill that gap. Another option, a lot of times with these properties with expiring affordability, we want to preserve them, but also we want to make sure that the condition is such that it's giving a quality of life to the tenants who live there while also being affordable. And so a lot of times when we acquire property, we really want to also invest in physical improvements of that property. So another option would be, and the issue here is just that these next two options take more time to go through the different procedures that you have to follow with the different sources. But what we could also do is renew and extend the HAP contract, go through a markup to market process with HUD where you actually get the market rents, and that process just takes longer than a standard renewal of that contract. With those increased rents, you can see the difference between our borrowing capacity. It more than doubles. So we can borrow $4 million on those increased rents. And then that we still have a fair amount of equity or OED funds that we can use those funds as equity to pair with the loan. And then we also just need it to support the acquisition cost of about $800,000. And then the third option is layering on with any of these financing tools. Often you can layer on the low-income housing tax credits, and that equity is very important to increasing the amount of renovation that we would be able to do at the property. So with increased rents and the supported debt there and some soft funds and low-income housing tax credits, you can see that we'll be able to meet the $2.5 million purchase price and also significantly improve the housing resource. But those are kind of the layers of funding sources and resources that we would be looking at when trying to preserve this property. The second case study is somewhat similar except for, so it's an existing rent-restricted property, except for there's no housing assistance payments contract, so there's no rental subsidy on this property. This property is an existing low-income housing tax credit property, restricted to 60% of the area median income and below. So you already see that the affordability isn't as low, though I would say just as important to have those 60% AMI units. But we are capped at the restriction for a 60% AMI rent, and we have no opportunity for additional rental subsidy. So that presents different challenges. Again, the seller's goal is to get the market value for the sale. In this particular case, we have 65 units at 60% of the AMI, like I said. It has a similar condition to the previous example, where this is in a highly desirable neighborhood. It was located right next to Cheeseman Park, close to bus lines and amenities, so it's a very high rent neighborhood. And again, if we lose these affordable units, there's no comparable unit in this neighborhood for the tenants to go to, so we would be displacing the residents from their current home to another part of town. In this case, the 60% restricted rent is $945. So it's higher than the 30% rent, which gives you more borrowing capacity, but also it's not equivalent to the market rent, which is much higher at about $1,275 in this area. So the challenges that presents when we're a buyer wanting to preserve and improve this housing and keep it affordable, we have a purchase price pretty similar to the last one, $6,750,000, which is about $104,000 per unit. The financing that we would look at on this one that would close quickly for a preservation option would be using those 60% rents to leverage about $5 million in debt. That's all that the property can support with the rent restriction. So you can see that we would need to go to a resource like OED for a soft loan for about $2 million. And of course, if we needed to do this is just to acquire the building to get to that $6.7 million purchase price. To do any amount of improvements, we'd be asking for more subsidy or more soft funds, I guess I should say, from OED in that case. Then the second option takes more time. And you run into this a lot with buying a property. A seller wants to not only get market value, but sell it very quickly. And market buyers can typically buy a lot more quickly than us affordable buyers. So we're competing both with price and time when we're trying to get this property instead of a market rate buyer. So the second option, though, if we have the time to do it, we would do the scenario above with the $5 million in debt, because we have no subsidy to borrow anymore. But we can also leverage 4% or 9% low-income housing tax credits, and that's going to add a layer of equity to the project. And that process just takes more time to go through. And then we would probably also find ourselves with a gap, depending on the level of renovation we need to do at the property, where we'd also be looking for some soft funds up to about $2 million. So those were my examples.
Thank you, Jennifer. Okay, great.
So I'm going to briefly go over a case which is Bunker Hill Apartments. So this is a city-restricted property with an expiring redevelopment agency covenant with an original term of 30 years. But also it also had an expiring Section 8 contract, which was one of those that were 30-year terms, we don't see those a lot, but yeah, it's an old contract. The owner is a for-profit owner with some legacy concerns and issues. This case was interesting because the city, with what I still consider limited resources, had to prioritize between the affordability of the property, maintaining the HAP contract in place, also taking into consideration the characteristics of the tenants. As you could see, most of them are elderly, and the income sources, they're really low. But also at the same time, also to consider, take into consideration that if the city would get paid back and what to do with those funds. So we had to balance and see what made more sense for us. Building is in Chinatown, 20 units. The redevelopment agency had really high AMI levels back then. Built in 1986, senior population. The rents that you see there, those are the rents under the rehab contract. But the average monthly contributions towards rent was an average of $335 per resident, so really deeply affordable and subsidized. The ownership, as I mentioned, is a for-profit, was the original owner, member of the community as well. And his goals were basically, we saw this as an untraditional request, and this was out of our efforts to find out what the owner's goals and interests were when we were analyzing each of the properties. So we started finding out more about the owner. We met this owner at one of our summits that we had for owners of affordable housing. And so we started talking to him, and his concern was that he was in his 80s, and he wanted to leave the property to his daughter and grandchildren, but at the same time, he didn't want to leave them with debt in place, but he cared about continuing the affordability for the tenants. So he owed about $2,298,000 to the city. You could see the principal balance there, and the accrued interest, I think we had it at 8% from way back. This deal took about close to 2 years, believe it or not, and it was because of the ownership type and actually working step by step with the owner and to try to choose and to try to guide them through the process. The property was appraised at $4.8 million. The owner could actually refinance the property for $1.8. The property was also in good physical condition. So the city was faced with two options, the way we see it. One is the first one is a non-preservation option, and the second one is the preservation option. So you could see that the city could actually get repaid principal and interest, $2.2 million, let's say, and we had the option to use those funds to buy down affordability at another property, but also we had the opportunity to probably use those funds for new construction, for gap financing, maybe up to $350,000 per unit, and so at the same time, there was a risk that the owner was going to terminate the covenant because it wouldn't make sense for him to keep it going. And so we were faced with the loss of potential rental subsidies and also displacement. Given the fact that most of the tenants were elderly, even though if the HAP contract terminates, it would trigger enhanced vouchers, but because of the age, at some point the tenants would end up leaving the property. And the other was the preservation option was for the owner to refinance the loan and actually make repairs. But we came to and also have the owner repay the principal, and also for the city to reduce the interest over 20 years at $85,000 per unit as a total investment, and negotiate a 20-year covenant and HAP contract. So the city had to look at getting paid or actually doing one of the things that hadn't been done, which it was forgive interest. So it's something new. So there's the two options. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Franklin and Jennifer. So in the interest of time, I think we were going to have another case study, but I think we'll go ahead and get to the interactive part right now. So we had 3 case studies. The project-based Section 8 with expiring rent restrictions, restricted rents, no Section 8, but expiring rent restrictions, and then the one that Franklin presented the restricted rents and the project-based Section 8 expiring rent restrictions, but with a sort of a family owner with legacy concerns. So at your tables, you have worksheets, and the worksheets have these questions on it, but what we'd like you to look at when you're considering which of these projects to fund, if any, that you have a preservation budget of $3 million. So which of these opportunities would you invest in? What factors should be considered when deciding how to target limited resources among the potential investments? Are there other ways to structure financing or resources that can be leveraged to increase the city's capacity to preserve more of the units? And what supports, if any, should be provided to the tenants if units are not being preserved, and how should that support be funded? So we have until 12:30 to discuss the pros and cons of these different case studies and what your priorities are, how you would prioritize them, how you would fund them. So we have until 12:30, and you can jot down your notes on the worksheets at your table. I don't think there's one for every person, but the table can share. And then we'll be reporting out highlights at 12:30, insights, what you wanted to prioritize and why, starting at 12:30. So get interacting and discussing. But so it sounds like that happened. So thank you all for hanging in there. I know it's getting late. And hopefully you've also had a chance to have some good discussions at your table. And we'd love, and captured some of the comments on the worksheets, which I know OED is going to be gathering and using that feedback. So if we could maybe ask for people who are so inclined to come up to, is that microphone working back there? Or maybe it's small enough that we can just talk, but there, I guess there is a microphone back there. Yeah, maybe so. So Julie's going to have that to pass around, and if we'd like to hear what your prioritization is, what you think should be funded, why, any insights you may have come up with, pros and cons, that kind of thing. So who would like to go first? Now, I heard a lot of talking out there the last 15 minutes.
I'll start.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, I'm Tim Hoppin. We had a good discussion at our table. So we thought about investing in number 1 and number 2. The reason we like that is they both had a fairly low investment per unit, which was an important factor, but not the deciding factor. We did like that both would leverage federal sources, being the Section 8 contracts. So, you know, being able to raise rents through mark-to-market really helped you take advantage of a lot more. Your lending powers increased. We also noticed on number 4, that one seemed like a good choice too, because there's a lot of units, but we noticed that there was only a $50 rent increase, and that didn't seem as significant of an issue as some of these other ones where they were going to be nearly doubled. So that kind of struck out number 4. And then number 3, I think we thought was a great project, had a little trouble following exactly how much OED would need to invest in that to keep that one going. So that was kind of our thoughts on those.
Thank you. Good thoughts. Anybody else would like to share? Maybe some of our bigger tables, if you had a little more in-depth discussion. All right, I'm going to have to start picking on people. How about Melissa? Can I pick on you, Melissa? Can you share what your table talked about?
So we also liked number 1 and number 2. We thought about $1 million towards number 1 and $2 million towards number 2. We looked at the market need, so those 30% units on the first one, and then the 60% on the second. So we also considered that the first one was in a gentrifying neighborhood, also close to the light rail, and also number 2 was close to bus lines, so important factors there. We talked about using LIHTC to maybe do the renovations later, and just using that as a good leverage source. Also looking at gap funding from potentially DOLA, a little plug there, and the importance of tax credits as well in these deals.
Great, thank you, Melissa. What about, let me ask, did people talk about the residents, about any potential support for residents that should be provided? Should that be part of that 3 million preservation budget, or? I think we should do something for those residents. Yeah, we need some vouchers for those residents. Any other additional insights or comments that people had about the different case studies? What about that table in the far back there? Darren, I'm going to pick on you now. I know you'll have some good insights. I'll put you on the spot.
Thanks, Beth. I appreciate that. We actually had a lot consistent conversations with the other two tables. We did talk about the subsidy per unit, which was why we did like number 2, so same comment. And we also did, consistent with the second table, talked about LIHTC, and it seemed to make sense to, there was no guidance given really with respect to timing. So we talked about, to the extent there is time to put in place tax credits on either 1 or 2, that seemed to make sense to, leverage other dollars and potentially reduce or maybe even eliminate OED's funding into some of these deals.
Thank you. Sarah, did you have a comment?
I just had sort of a general comment from the first part and the second part when we're talking about tax credits and other resources. And sort of first off, it's great to talk about tax credits and doing these with 4% credits, but they're really, really hard to make work. And so trying to figure out if there's going to be some sort of really targeted focus of using 9% to do preservation deals, because it's so competitive, as everyone knows, and whether or not you try and put in a preservation deal as a 9%, without really knowing if the political will is there, I think makes a big difference. And then when you were talking about Los Angeles and sort of identifying properties, it just makes me think it would save me and my clients so much time if the city would come to us and say, we've identified these properties we'd really like, as opposed to me looking at every random thing that comes across my client's desk to see if it makes sense. But if there's no political will to kind of invest in that property because of the deep thinking you guys are doing about it, it would help so much if we can get more information as you have it about where your priorities are, because I really feel like I don't know. And maybe it's because I haven't reached out to find it, but if you can make that more sort of available to folks, it would just help. And I'm sure, Jennifer, you know. But anyway, so that was it. Thanks.
Yeah, I think those are good comments. We were actually just talking while you all were discussing about the pros and cons of preservation in the 4% versus 9%. But I think your comments are well taken, Sarah, about our priorities. And we have developed sort of a preservation priority matrix, which outlines higher priority properties versus lower ones, and trying to work on identifying specific properties along that. And we haven't gotten that information out to a wider public as yet, but that's something we're working on, and I completely agree with you, and we'll continue to work on that to try and get that information out. What about any other general comment, or do you have a comment too?
Quick question. We actually heard from, in New York, for example, their housing agency, what they're doing is they're averaging. So and I don't know if Chaff has had any discussions about this, but you have the cost of housing that's increasing much faster than incomes. So folks at the 50 and 60% level, like 60% AMI, there's projects where they're slightly overqualified by just a few dollars a month or a few dollars a year. And so what they're doing in New York is they are saying, okay, if you take the average of your 60% AMI and your 50s, and if you're slightly over, then on your 50s, you just charge slightly less, so that the folks that are just barely overqualified but can't afford market rents anywhere else, they're able to live in that project. I don't know if Chafa has had any conversations around that.
Not that I'm aware of, and maybe some other Chafa people in the room are aware of some conversations like that. But I mean, I think that's the kind of thing that we need some of these different ideas, since we can't always bring resources to a project. So we need to be looking at some of these other ideas. I know we're pretty much out of time right now, but I do want to share, my email is btruby, T-R-U-B-Y, at chafainfo.com, chfainfo.com. And I'm happy to hear any ideas like that we can look at, or any other ideas that you may have that we can try and look at as part of our strategic preservation planning and implementation. So I just want to thank everybody for a good session. I want to thank our panelists, and thanks to Julie and OED for hosting this event, and thank you all for coming. Gotta give that. It's too late. Oh, it's back on. It's back on.
Hi, really quickly before everyone heads to lunch, we wanted to just take a couple of minutes in each of the breakout sessions to ask Denver's community planning and development folks to come up and talk a little bit about the ongoing Denver Right process. Yes. Just leave them.
You can leave them on the table and we'll collect them.
That's all right. Thanks, Julie, and thanks for taking just a couple of extra minutes. I'm Abe Barge. I work for the Community Planning and Development Department for Denver, and we're really excited that this is happening, and we're soaking a lot of stuff up. One of the things we want to make sure that everybody knows is that there are several big planning processes happening in the city right now. A land use plan, a couple of transportation plans, pedestrian plan, a transit plan, a parks plan. It's all under the umbrella of something called Denver Right. And you can, it's Denver RIGHT. We've got this swag out at a table out there, so come collect it and ask us questions about it. One of the parts of it that might be of most interest to you is the Land Use and Transportation Plan, Blueprint Denver, and you may have heard of it, is being comprehensively updated right now, and we're in a fairly early part of that. This is the plan that has the areas of change and areas of stability in it, and then gets down to a land use concept for the whole city about where growth should happen and how, and so it's really relevant to the kinds of conversations that we're having, and hope that you'll be involved. So www.denvergov.org/DenverRight, and there's several planners out there at a table ready to answer questions and give you stuff. Thanks.
Thanks, Abe, and that really is all, I swear.